Hey everybody, welcome back to Mike's Wooden Things and Stuff, and welcome to another shop project to solve another storage solution. No, I'm not going to solve a solution at all. Another shop storage project. I'm going to build myself a sharpening station over by the lathe so I can get a slow speed grinder to put on top of it and have some more storage underneath for my sharpening stones and guide dealies for my chisels and plane irons and things, and a cabinet underneath so I can put bowl blanks and maybe a couple of routers. So essentially this is a smaller version of the sideboard that I eventually want to build out of all that sapele that's up under the garage door. And I'm going to pull down some Douglas fir and do it in Douglas fir and oak ply with a walnut drawer front so that I match this cabinet and the whiskey cabinet on the other side, because eventually that's how I want all of my cabinets in here. So let's pull down some wood. We'll get cutting. I kind of have approximate measurements in my head, and I just rewatched the Matt Cremona sideboard video to refresh myself with how this is going to go together, theoretically. And we'll see what comes out. It's my first frame and panel case construction. So here's hoping. Let's get some wood. Let's go. Welcome. Come on.
Okay, so as always, we're gonna hop up on the ladder and we're gonna start looking for wood. I thought I had a nice piece of rift sawn 8/4 Douglas fir for the legs, but the piece that I had actually was way too short to get all 4 of my legs out of, so I had to go with a different piece. But you know what, shop project, I got over that really fast, and then a bunch of 4/4 stuff that I can pull down to start making all the other pieces out of, brush it all off, and start looking at what I'm dealing with here. So and break it down couple inches oversized with the jigsaw, just get things manageable at this point, and then we can figure out what it is that we've got, what we're looking at, working around knots, that kind of thing. Milling process, again, I will eventually do a video on my whole milling process, but it's basically one flat face, one square edge to that face, over to the table saw to parallel up the opposite edge, and then over to the planer to parallel up the opposite face. Lots of information out there if you're unsure how to mill material. I will eventually do one, but this is my favorite part of the entire furniture making process, is once you've got things milled, you can start picking out pieces that do what you want them to do, and all the grain selection and part placement on the boards. It's one of my favorite parts of the whole. Other than putting finish on the final project, I think it's my second favorite part. So now we're breaking the legs down into square stock. If you're looking at the end of that board, you can see that this piece is essentially quarter sawn, which is not ideal for leg stock, but like I said, shop project. You can always fiddle around with things later and find grain directions and things that are going to work for you. While the table saw is set up at the width of the legs, I can cut the dividers that need to be the same width as those legs. So this is part of the process, is when you have a machine set up to do a width, or you have a stop block to do a length, you need to be thinking ahead and cut those things to be the same. So here we're ganging up all 4 of the legs to make sure that they are going to be all exactly the same length. Cut them all at the same time. You don't have to worry about setting up stop blocks and stuff. Gang them together. Same with these side pieces. These are the side assemblies that I'm cutting. I need 4 of those to all be the same length, so cut those at the same time too. Here I am ganging up all of the front and back pieces that are all going to need to be the same length. We'll cut those all at the same time too. Gang them up. Make sure everything is going to be the same length. That way you have a really good chance of everything being square at the end. So at the end of milling day, I clamp everything down so that overnight it doesn't get all wonky on me, hopefully. When you're removing material, sometimes moisture changes and stuff can get things to be wonky, so give yourself a chance and keep them flat overnight. Then we can start arranging the leg blanks in what is the most pleasing situation. If they were all rifts on, it wouldn't be that big a deal, but then you mark the joinery on those faces, because if I don't, I will screw that up later. So mark that joinery out and keep track of it, because it's really easy to get disoriented. I do all the joinery on, well, not all the joinery, but the majority of the joinery I'm doing on this project is floating mortise and tenons, loose mortise and tenons, slip tenons, whatever you want to call them. I've done this process numerous times in my videos. It's basically, if you know anything about the domino, it's essentially the same thing. I'm just doing it with a router, 1/4 inch router bit and 1/4 inch hobby wood from big box store, and then you cut those out, glue those in. It's entirely strong enough for furniture. And then these are the side assemblies again. So put those tenons in the mortises, attach the top one, and then I can measure up from the bottom of the legs with a combination square that remains set through the entire process. I want to say that about 2.5 inches up from the bottom, give or take, because I wanted to have about a 2-inch taper on the bottom of the legs, and then I can square those lines across, do exactly the same thing, loose mortise and tenons, and here it is going into the leg, which I unfortunately had to put on a little bit of an angle in my leg vise in order to get my fence on my router to ride nicely. And then we can do the first of many dry assemblies. Throughout this process, I think I put things together and took them apart probably 20 times. And that's just the way it goes. And so this is another example of, once I get that stop block set, I'm cutting the shoulders on the drawer separators. I'm terrible at terminology. But when that stop block is set, you cut everything that needs to be cut at that, all at the same time. And so here's marking the front and back rails, I guess they would be called. And so now we've got yet another dry assembly, and here I am marking off where I need to route the grooves for the panels of the frame and panel construction. Again, you mark them on there so that you don't mess it up later and put a panel groove in the wrong side of a piece. And then do a quick sanding so that it's not got any little rough edges and stuff. Then we can start cutting our 1/4 inch oak plywood down to size to get them to fit into those grooves in between legs and stiles and rails and etc, etc. Mark them off the piece where possible. And this is one of my favorite parts of this entire build, is when I cut these panels, I was dry assembling the side assemblies, and it all came together. And the happy dance. You gotta do a happy dance when things work out. And then when I'm dry assembled like this, I can mark where I need to taper the legs on the inside sides. The two inside faces need to be tapered, and then I can mark those out precisely with combination squares set again. And they don't really need to be exact. You can just approximate them because they're not going to be right next to each other. Nobody's going to notice if they're a little bit off. But, you know, make them as close as you can, right? And then over to the oscillating belt sander to smooth out those faces off the bandsaw. And then I took an old template that I had from an old coffee table that looked like a nice curve, and I cut it into the front bottom rail because I like curvy rails. And then yet another dry assembly with those side assemblies together, front bottom rail, back, top, and bottom rails, and this is starting to look like a piece of furniture. And so now the drawer divider front pieces, the top one that goes into the top of the legs gets dovetailed. I've done this before with a fence angle jig thing that I learned from Matt Cremona, and then cut those sides off and chisel to clean up all those faces. Did cut the bottom cheek, I guess it would be called, which later will end up helping me out in terms of laying out the pin board, which is the top of the leg, and you'll see that in a second. So once that gets cut on the bandsaw, you can clean that up with a chisel, set the depth stop on the marking gauge, and then you can mark that out. See, this is where that little cheek cut helps, because you can now rest that cheek cut against the front of the leg so that it sits nice and securely while you're marking out that tail onto the top of the leg. The marking gauge is set for depth, and we can get over to the drill press to hog out the majority of the material on that pin, which feels weird to say because it's actually the top of a leg, but it is essentially the pin board of the dovetail joint. And we chisel the rest of that out and pare it away until it fits nice and snug, and then we can move on to the other one. And the double tenon, for some reason, somehow I lost the footage of me doing it, so I had to download my Instagram video of me fitting that joint together. But it's exactly the same process that I did with both the dovetail and the next joint that I'm cutting, which is the upright divider between the two front drawer dividers. So essentially I'm dividing those two into two drawers, and I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do the shoulders on the table saw. This one I'm gonna do the whole thing on the table saw and then clean it up with a chisel after. But we do the shoulders, hog away the rest of the material, and then we can work on fitting that piece to the drawer dividers themselves. And so we mark on the approximate location, and then yes, one of those tenons is longer than the other after shaving it down, but it's not a structural piece. It's not holding the cabinet together. It's not that big a deal. And so as long as we've got those, you set the combination square again to where we want it to be, and we mark around that tenon. And as long as that combination square stays set on both the top and bottom drawer divider rail things, they in theory should end up perfectly square. So same thing, we get rid of most of the material with the drill press, clean it up with chisels until it fits nice and snug. And if you're being careful all the way along, all of these things will come together. If I can do it, anybody can do it, I swear. This is where I finally realized that I did need that back top rail to be significantly wider than I originally cut it, so that I could put in drawer runners later and have them actually attached to something on the back of the cabinet. So I had to mill up another piece of material and attach it to the back rail and basically recreate the top back rail so that it was wide enough to actually secure a drawer runner to later, because I was not thinking earlier when I made my back top rail. So we just make that into a double tenon situation into the legs and move on. So now, see, it's a significantly wider back rail than it was before, but now I can actually connect drawer runners from that front drawer divider to the back of the cabinet, which is kind of an important part of a cabinet when you have drawers in it. And now we can move on to the back panel dividers. You just sneak up on the cut. You've got everything dry fit. Just sneak up on the cut, a little bit at a time, until that fits nice and snug into that back cavity, I guess, for lack of a better term. And once that fits nice and snug, we can rip that piece of Doug's fir into two, so that we're making essentially three frame and panel sections on the back of the cabinet. And then, what's next? Oh, then we gotta run grooves for the panels on those pieces. And because I'm using a 1/4 inch upcut spiral bit on all of this joinery, by the way. So these ones get all the way down the side grooves as well. Then we can set the inset, I guess, of the tenons, and we can route those ones a little bit deeper so that that tenon has a little more meat to grab onto when we're joining this all together. And now we're going to do the back assembly, dry fit, and make sure that everything is still going together and it's still square and everything is still working the way that it's supposed to. Pound it together with a mallet, make sure everything is aligned and goes together. It's starting to look like a piece of furniture, I gotta say. This is kind of the point in a piece of furniture that I start to realize that this is gonna be a piece of furniture. So now we're cutting back panels for these things. The two outside ones are exactly the same because I measured them from the cheek? No. I guess. From the outside of the piece, they're exactly the same, and then I just have to re-measure for the inside one that's a little bit skinnier, but no big. And then we can start to sand all the pieces. I think I want to say I went up to 150 before assembly, and then I can do a finer sand after things are actually assembled. Get the epoxy out, start putting in the tenons, start putting in the pieces, start tacking it all together. Do them in sub-assemblies. So the side assemblies I did as one so I did both side assemblies together and then put the dry fit of the whole thing back together while it sets. And then the back assembly and the front drawer dividers and bottom rail go into a second assembly so that you're not trying to put together 30 pieces at the same time while your glue is dry. So side assemblies, set up, and then you pull it back apart, put the front and back assemblies into those side assemblies so that it can all dry up. So the back assembly goes in, pound together, glue in those front drawer dividers and bottom rail, and then that whole thing gets all clamped up while all the glue sets. And it's probably my most complicated glue up of all time. It worked out well. thanks to the fact that the side assemblies were already glued up and secure before I started that. And now we can work on those drawer runners that I was talking about earlier that I needed to widthenize the back rail in order to accommodate, because I wasn't thinking. And the same thing, sneak up on the cut until they fit nice and snug. And then you can rip those drawer runners to the width that's going to work for them. And the outside drawer runners needed to have a little notch cut in them, but we'll get to that, apparently, because now I'm testing pocket screws to make sure they're not going to expose themselves later. So we're measuring out the little notch that I need to cut out of the side drawer runners, so we can notch those out before we cut those pocket screw holes, which we tested for earlier to make sure that everything was set up properly. And then we can get those attached. Middle one obviously didn't need the notches cut out, but it did need to span between the drawer divider on the front so that it can serve as the drawer runner for both drawers on that inside section. Then we can glue in the upright portions of the drawer runners, make sure that they're all squared up so that drawers can run nice and smooth. I didn't clamp them. I don't think it's going to be a problem. They're drawer runners. Then we can work on the bottom supports, I guess we'll call them. Just took a scrap offcut from the project and countersunk a whole whack of screw holes into it, cut them into sections, and then I cut a piece of what I'm going to use as the bottom platform, I guess, for lack of a better term. There's the cut piece, and then I can use that as the spacer to super glue on the supports before continuing to screw them in. And theoretically, by using that a piece of the actual bottom panel to space those out, they'll all be equidistant from where I want them to sit. And then you can cut the bottom panel itself. And this is just, it's 1-inch MDF skinned with fake cherry veneer that I have sitting around in the shop because it was super cheap one day when I was at the store, and I was like, yeah, I like super cheap, and I just want to get rid of it. So I think it's a temporary bottom panel for this project, but we'll see. I may never end up changing it because it's the inside bottom of a cabinet and it works just fine. So look at that. It's like, it's an actual piece of furniture at this point. We do need to make a top for it though. So here we go. We're pulling down another couple of pieces of Douglas fir to glue up a panel to make a top for it. And it's same process. Bucket down to approximate size. Get things milled up, flat, square, jointed, plain, etc., etc., etc. Like, why am I even showing this? I already showed the milling boards. But whatever. I'm making the top panel. Glue, glue, glue. Panel, panel, panel. This one I did have to use some, well, I didn't have to, but I decided to just make some little packing tape wrapped cowls to put over the individual joints, just to make sure that this thing was going to come out as even and flat as humanly possible, because I did not want to be doing a bunch of work on this top panel before I needed to put it on. And then we can cut the bevel on the front. I wasn't really that picky about what the bevel was. I want to say it was about 30 degrees. Bevel on the front and both sides, but not the back. And then we could sand everything. I want to say I went to 180 on the whole thing, top, cabinet, etc., etc. And here is a beautiful moment in furniture making where I realized that I did not figure out how I was going to attach the top to the cabinet. Yeah. So how are you gonna put that on there and allow for wood movement? Idiot. Okay, well, we'll go with S-clips and an 1/8 inch router bit. Because normally when I'm using S-clips, I would have run those grooves over the table saw on the back rail and the front rail and everything ahead of time before it was glued up. But I can't do that when it's already a cabinet. So I routed the grooves in, and it worked fine. I was still a little pissed at myself for not figuring it out ahead of time. But then we can wipe on a couple coats of finish. I just did it with Howard's Feed and Wax because it's super easy. Buff it in, buff it out. But man, does that stuff come alive. Putting finish on a thing, it's my favorite. And then once we got things finished, you just smudge. You get like Howard's Feed and Wax oil and wax finish is fantastic especially for stuff you don't need to be super durable. Just spooge it in and wipe off the excess. It's great. Then we can attach the top using the S-clips, and we're done with at least the carcass of my new sharpening station. Yeah. Well, I have to call this one done for now because I need it out of my way so that I can get back to some other things that I need to accomplish over the next little bit. I will come back hopefully shortly and get some doors and drawers on the front of this. For now, I'm going to use it for bowl blank storage. I'm going to get a slow speed grinder for the top of it and put it into use, and we will address the rest of the build shortly. I'm happy with how it's going so far. I learned some things. I screwed some things up, which I may or may not have learned from. We'll find out in the future. But for now, it's going to be a pretty nice addition to the shop, and it's going to be even nicer when I finish it. I do have a Patreon page. If you like what I do here, over at patreon.com/woodenthings and stuff, you can help me out. And we'll see you next time when I'm doing something else. Probably completely uncabinet related, because I kind of just want to ignore this for a bit. I have far too much time invested in this thing for a piece of shop furniture. But if you've been around for a while, you know that sometimes happens. Yeah, stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.